Hey there hunters, and welcome back to the Gunners Guild. Today we're going to be discussing a few build ideas revolving around the new Corrupted Savior that was added in the recent patch for Remnant 2. I've been hearing a lot of mixed feedback and reception towards the Corrupted Savior, so I figured I'd talk about it and showcase some builds to give you ideas for how to use it, or maybe give you an idea if you even want to use it. So with that said and done, let's just get into these builds. So to start, we're going to review the Corrupted Savior so you can get an idea of its strengths and weaknesses before we dive into the builds. Corrupted Savior is something like its counterpart actually. This is basically the fusion rifle from Remnant 1 in every sense. It's a fully automatic laser rifle which will ramp up its rate of fire as its mod gains charges. The mod will fire a penetrating railgun that pierces enemies and does some seriously monstrous damage. And if we take a look at the base stats of the Corrupted Savior, it's got a solid damage of 51 compared to Typewriter at 30 and Monarch at 36. Of course, the rate of fire is lower, but that is the default rate of fire. At 5 stacks of this mod, it is significantly faster, even faster than Monarch. It's probably our new strongest automatic weapon that we have right now, and it's really only going to get better from there. The range is incredibly solid at 20 meters, and the clip size is 50. It has 10% grip and 100% weak spot damage, means there's not really any visible downsides to this gun. Even the reload speed is pretty fast, so no complaints there at all. The only written downsides to this gun is that the descriptor says that it removes mod power if you don't deal damage for 2 seconds. Sure, that may be an issue, but in reality, that might as well not exist. Because while you would normally lose power, you don't if A, you happen to be using the Atonement Fold because it deals damage to you and that counts as dealing damage, so it does sustain Savior that way, or B, you're using Archon, which will generate 3 mod power per second, which is also enough to sustain the mod. So in reality, if you're building this for range damage, you can sustain it, and if you're building it for mod damage, you can sustain it. So it doesn't really seem like it actually has an actual downside. Now I've gushed over this gun quite a bit already, but let's go into a few minor issues that I do have with the Savior. First is that it has no swap animation, which isn't necessarily a con because it's technically better for your DPS because you can just swap and shoot at the same time and go right into shooting, but that's a bug and that's going to be fixed, but it is just an interesting quirk for now. The next part is that I actually don't like the mod for a handful of reasons. The mod doesn't just fire when you press the mod button like it did in Remnant 1. Like almost every other mod in Remnant 2, it's an ammo swap mod, so you have to press the button to turn on the mode to fire it, and then press click again to actually fire this mod. Now this wouldn't be so bad, but the mod also has a small charge up time before it actually fires, so you do have to pre-plan for shooting it that way, because there's a decent amount of time when you'll want to actually use the mod and when the mod actually comes out. So you do have to press your mod button to swap to fire mode, press click to start the fire animation, and then wait like a quarter of a second for the charge and then for it to fire. And I actually don't like that. After firing the mod, there's also like a small cooldown before it swaps back to the normal firing animation. You can speed this up though by manually clicking your mod swap button again to force it back into its regular firing mode, but again it's just making the gun take a lot more timing and buttons to get the mod out, and it feels super clunky to use in that regard. So I'm not really a fan of the whole thing. Like the damage is great, but using it just feels like awful. Now the last thing about the mod though is that while it does penetrate, you can't penetrate anything at close ranges. So if a bunch of enemies charge you, you're kinda boned, because the mod laser will fire at the angle from the tip of your gun to where the crosshair currently is. So if something is relatively close, that angle from the gun to the crosshair is very sharp, which will cause the mod to shoot off into a very sharp angle and not really penetrate anything that you want, at least at close ranges. At long range, it doesn't really have that issue, but it is still super annoying. That being said, the mod does still slap for outrageous numbers, like 15 to 20k, so yeah, sometimes you gotta put up with a lot to get a lot. But that's the Corrupted Savior's pros and cons. Let's get into the builds. I'm going to start with an old reliable setup and one of my favorites, the skill loop. This is a traditional Hugs build that focuses entirely on ranged crit, but with the added twist of sustaining their skills, hopefully infinitely. I have previously showcased this, but let's take it from the top because it's been quite a while. So the whole idea with the skill loop is to use the Devoured loop to fish for crits with a high rate of fire weapon to sustain your archetype skills and basically spam those forever. So your choice of archetype is kinda up to you and what skills you want to sustain. While Hugs is the traditional setup, you actually have a few options these days. Challenger can help sustain Rampage, which is a great skill. I personally don't like all the animations of turning it off and on, but that's just me. Ritualist is also a great one because you can sustain Death Wish, which is a really good skill. and you also still get solid damage out of its perks if you keep the target status, which is not hard if you just throw a grenade at something. And Alchemist is also a good option as well if you're going to run Frenzy Dust. Now I went with Gunslinger Hunter in that order for two very specific reasons. One is that I wanted Gunslinger as my prime because using it to sustain Bulletstorm will not only reload my weapon on use, so I can increase my DPS by cutting out the downtime for reloading, but also because this will grant me short bursts of infinite ammo, and let me tell you that Savior chews through ammo, so this is going to be a good option for me to fix two issues that I have with the setup at the same time. Now with Hunter, I went with for more just, generic crazy damage boost because of its traits, though I also prefer to run Huntress Mark because it helps me deal with trash and adds and clearing zones effectively while not being surprised by anything sneaking up on me. Plus, a lot of the bosses don't just give you much time to sustain like Hunter's Aim or whatever the other Hunter skills are called, so it's just easier and consistent across the board, and I do love my consistency. So Hunter with Huntress Mark is my choice there. Since we already touched upon the ring that skill loop is revolving around, let's get into the rest of the trinkets and get that out of the way. And with no surprise to what we're using, it's basically what everyone has been using forever to stack as much crit as possible. We have to go with Atonement Bolt for 10% crit, but also the Bleed and Inflict sustains our mod, so that's never going to drop, which is a great double dip bonus there. Then we're going to have Probability Cord for 30% crit damage, and then you have the choice between Xania's Malice for that fat 30% weak spot damage, or Akari's Warband for the crit and crit damage. Though you don't really need the extra crit chance, the crit damage is also nice though. For the neck, shocker, Abrasive Whetstone. You didn't see that coming, I know. You just throw a grenade or something, bleed is easy to sustain, especially with the Affliction trait, it's free damage. So again, all this is just to build crit back into the Devoured loop so we can, every single shot, basically have that 1% chance to reset our skill cooldowns. For the relic, we're using the standard trifecta, crit chance, crit damage, and then you have the chance between fire rate and weak spot damage. I like fire rate because it makes the gun go burr. Now, you're free to choose whatever relic you want, I don't think it matters all that much, but if you're using any relic perk, you may want to go with one that has faster use speed. Likewise, your armor doesn't matter, it's a personal choice, just make sure you're in the weight bracket that you prefer. I would just change the traits around to compensate for that as well. For example, let's take a look at the traits that we're running. Now, Affliction may seem like an odd choice, but it does help us sustain our bleeds for longer, so it's definitely worth using. Same goes for Flashcaster. Seems like an odd choice, but we do use our skills quite a bit, so making them, actually cast faster is going to save us some time. Swiftness and Footwork are basically mandatory for me. You got to have all the moves that you can. So you have then the option to swap out of Untouchable, Bark Skin, Expertise, and Endurance. We don't technically need Expertise because we want to refresh a cooldown through Devoured Loop anyway, but it is nice to have like a little backup plan just in case. But you can adjust those traits to better suit a bulky tank setup with Fortify or Strong Back or Siphoner if you wanted, or stay light and run Evasion, Stamina Regen, and your choice of whatever. None of this is going to really impact your DPS significantly, so play the build that makes you comfortable. I don't condone using any Immortal Zombie tank builds though because that's pretty boring, so avoid that stuff. Now for the weapons, obviously we're going to be running the Corrupted Savior with the Momentum Mutator. Easily the best mutator for automatic weapons, 30% crit and crit damage, you can't really pass that up. Melee weapon, dealer's choice. I like World's Edge to cleave through groups of enemies, but that's just me. And sidearm is going to be my favorite SMG. I usually put it in like a utility mod or a slow just in case, but I'll swap it around depending on what I need. And almost always I run the SMG with Twisted Wounds just because it makes it very easy to swap to and throw a few bullets to refresh a bleed on an enemy to hold up my Whetstone. It's faster than a grenade throw for sure, so you're more than welcome to run an alternate sidearm like the Corrupted Rune Pistol for the extra damage debuff, or Nebula for Swarm though, whatever you want, it's not going to be that big for this build. So that's all for the gear, let's talk about the performance. And I think I may have played enough clips at this point to show that this build absolutely slaps. It clears trash incredibly fast, it never runs out of ammo, it deals a ton of damage, and it just kind of blows through bosses without any problems either. I never use the mod, I just hold on to it to keep the rate of fire up on the weapon, and honestly, I don't really do much besides hold down the fire button. It's just a minigun that mows down enemies. I really like this because of how well it just deals with both zone clear and boss clear. And ads aren't going to be a problem because you just fire so fast and you can see everything. And you rarely have to worry about your clip size or your reload because Bulletstorm is almost always available. At least it should be if you properly play it. I don't think I really have anything negative to say about this build and its style, other than I guess it can be kind of boring to watch. Just because, all I'm doing is pressing the fire button. But honestly, the skill spam and the roulette skill resets and the full screen of numbers just does a lot to keep the ADD in check and keep it interesting. Plus, if you're running a glass cannon build like myself, like it's either kill or be one tapped, which is kind of just how I like it. So that's going to be the skill loop build, focusing on the primary fire of the Corrupted Savior, but now let's move on to the other builds that are going to be focusing on the mod portion of the gun. So unlike the range build, we're not actually going to be using the standard shooting of the Savior very much. We're going to actually want to be using the mod as much as possible, despite it being mechanically clunky to use, but big numbers are fun. But you can build this in two ways. The first is that you can go the traditional crit stacking route for big numbers and focus on getting just the biggest laser hit possible. 15 to 20k a pop is pretty doable, to be honest, and if you want to go this route, then Archon and Challenger are probably going to be your best bets. Both are going to provide you a 10% crit chance for your mod, as well as combined 85% increased damage. While none of the Challenger skills really matter all that much, Archon's Chaos Gate will support you just fine. Plus, we do kind of have the Archon anyway just for the mod regen bonus it provides. Then of course we're going to run the standard crit trinkets, which is going to be your Whetstone, your Atonement Fold, Probability Cord, and then of course you have Xania's Malice and Burden of the Follower for the extra mod regen. We're going to need that. You can swap out of Xania's Malice for Burden of the Gambler for bosses without accessible weak spots, or even Akari Warband if you keep up the dodges for the extra crit chance. Probably going to be a better option there. I didn't use that in any of these demonstrations just because, I'm lazy, but you can definitely run the Akari Warband. We're going to be using Savior with the feedback mutator this time around. The first line does nothing for us as it only generates like 6 mod power per second, which is pretty close to nothing to be honest. But the 10% damage dealt refunded as mod power means that when you do crit with a fusion laser, you're basically going to fully refund your mod and keep being able to spam the level 5 charges, which feels pretty awesome when you get those back-to-back crits. Now your melee weapon here is obviously still your choice, as is your handgun. I run the Nebula with the Harmonizer mutator. Nebula's Nanite Swarm provides corrosion now, so you can get 2 stacks of corrosion, and that does provide you with 10% additional damage, as well as the dot that'll help generate some mod power when you don't land those crits. As per the standard, you're going to want to go with whatever relic you're comfortable with, but the reprocessed heart can be used to generate extra mod power for a while at the cost of some of your life if you feel like you need it. For the fragments, I went with mod damage, reduced mod cost, and weak spot damage, since we're going to be banking on those juicy weak spot hits for the most part. And again, armor still your choice, just adjust the traits to better suit a bulkier playstyle with Fortify, Barkskin, Siphoner, versus an agile style with iframes, movement speed, and stamina. I would recommend keeping Affliction active just because it's going to help prolong our dots from Nebula, as well as their grenade to keep the bleed active. Now personally, I'm not a huge fan of this style and build because of a few factors. While the paper math on target dummy is great, when you land all those hits and the monster doesn't move, it's going to be far less effective in a real fight. Not only does the mod have a weird shooting animation and delay that can mess up your shot, and it does for me all the time, but a lot of the bosses also just have weak spots that aren't the easiest to hit with that kind of delay. I'm not saying it's bad to go this route, just that it's going to be a lot harder to play and nail just because of that. And since there's a good chance that you're going to miss your shot or not crit your hit or you have to move or reposition, your DPS is going to be a lot lower than the paper math on a target dummy. Plus, that means you're also not going to be generating your mod power back to its full potential, which will leave you having to shoot the Savior normally to fill up the rest of the mod, which is not good since we don't scale that at all and it hits like a wet noodle. Also, the area clear for this build is pretty bad. Getting through zones with really one functional mod is not the best idea, especially with how inconsistent the laser is with its penetration. Falling back onto Nebula as a primary weapon is not a great idea either, but it's something that you're probably going to have to do because the Savior is just not good in this setup to deal with trash and zone clear. So really, unless you're going to be resetting for good boss kill times with like crit RNG consistency, I don't really see the mod focused Savior as being a great option, at least in this form, so casual players may want to avoid this. That being said, you can still run this as an Archon and Ritualist setup to fall back on dots from Miasma to help provide a lot more consistent damage and mod power generation. While the laser is going to be a lot weaker, it will still hit for 8 to 12k, which ain't too shabby. But with this setup, I had much more success in both clearing maps, which became super easy, and bossing, which was a lot more consistent because, hey, sometimes I miss that laser. Not because I'm bad, I swear, but because the startup time and before it fires is just kind of annoying. For this setup, we're going to be running Energized Neck Coil, as our neck provides us with some big pops that will generate us a lot of mod power, as well as make it extremely easy to clear out entire zones and all the ads that may spawn wherever. For the rings, we're going to want Timekeeper's Jewel for the extra dot duration, which gives us a bigger explosion on Energized Net Coil. And because of the extra dot duration, we're going to have more time to use Savior's Fusion Cannon. We don't have to keep, applying dots over and over again. The other rings are going to be Burden of the Follower, because we still need that mod generation. The Ahane Crystal, because Miasma will give us 4 dots that will let us sustain the 20% multiplicative damage bonus, and you can choose between a Singed Ring for 10% multiplicative damage, or a Burden of the Warlock, which reduces your mod cost by 15%. Now, Warlock's actually going to bring your total mod cost down from 1500 mod power to 1200, which is closer to 20% reduced mod cost, because each charge is going to get lower cost. And this is going to help reduce the time you need to shoot the gun, because obviously you're going to need a lot less mod power overall. For the relic fragments, we're going to want to slip in elemental damage here, so our dots are a bit stronger and will generate us a bit more mod power, as well as the usual mod damage and reduced mod cost for fragments. Armor and relic themselves are our usual dealer's choice. I shouldn't have to keep mentioning that, but people are dumb, and if you don't point out every little thing, they get mad. Pick whatever you want. It has very little impact on the overall performance of the build. The traits, though, we do have some extra requirements. You are going to want to run Expertise for this build, especially if you're running Miasma over Death Wish, because you can get the dots from Miasma to last 40 seconds, and then the cooldown of the skill to last 36 seconds, meaning that you can sustain them infinitely, which is pretty awesome. You can also use a skill cooldown fragment to bring the cooldown to 40.5 seconds, and then save those trait points if you need the extra survivability, so that's an option as well. I do highly recommend using Siphoner if you're going to be using Burden of the Warlock, because the Fusion Cannon will instantly recover the 15% life consumed due to the Burden of the Warlock, assuming you do actually hit with it. So you're not going to feel that constant drain at all, which is an extra bonus. Plus, if you're running dots, Siphoner is going to keep you topped off all the time. It's just a nice added comfort. As for the guns, we're going to be using the same setup with Savior and the Feedback Mutator, and Nebula with Harmonizer. Thanks to Energized Net Coil and Nebula's new dots being applied to the Nanite Swarm, the Swarm mod becomes S tier for trash clear, as it easily chases down every single enemy and explodes on impact, and clears pretty much everything on Apocalypse difficulty without you. Like, it'll just clear zones, you just fire it and run. The melee weapon is still kind of your choice, but honestly, World's Edge with Tainted Blade is by far my favorite thing to use now. The dot scales with duration incredibly hard, which is going to allow Energized Net Coil to explode for 2 to 3k and cleave the entire screen pretty effortlessly. If Nebula's Nanite Swarm is on cooldown, or if you just need to generate more mod power, this will clear all the trash for you just fine and give you enough mod power to refill both Nebula and Savior. I do highly recommend going this route with your melee weapon. All in all, doing the dot setup for Corrupted Savior is much more comfortable for me personally. On bosses and especially on zone clear, it does very well. Mostly just because it's so consistent with damage, and thanks a lot to the dots really. Of course, this means that the playstyle is more like a traditional dot build with Savior tacked on top rather than a Savior Fusion Cannon build, which I understand because that could be a turnoff for people because you're kind of taking away the novelty of the idea here. But I did end up enjoying this much more, so I figured I'd include it in here with the rest of the Savior build. Now, remember that there is no right way to make builds, and ultimately whatever you're comfortable with is most important. I'm here to just inform you how things work and what works together, and just how to get some top-end DPS and clear speed potential, and then you can fine-tune things to your liking. While I prefer to do glass cannon builds, these can all be adapted for more tanky playstyles. And that's basically going to be it for me though. I think that's everything I got for these builds. So yeah, thank you all for watching. If you have any questions, concerns, whatever, please let me know. Hit me up in the Discord in the description below. But yeah, peace and good luck out there, hunters.